The domestic political issue that we analyzed was the topic of Trump's gun control policy. For our 3 stories used on the topic, we used CNN as our liberal article, Fox News for a conservative view, and an article from ABC News as a centrist stance.
The length of the CNN article was 899 words. It was very in-depth and included many quotes from statements the political figures have said on guns and the laws to regulate them, but mostly quotes from Donald Trump on regulation of guns. It runs through a couple events where things were stated. It states that not many know where Trump stands on gun control, mentions the Fix NIC's bill that was proposed which would help the schools with safety, and it also mentions that there is lots of uncertainty in the White House, but focuses on Trump being less right-winged on this issue than expected. Although this article was considered a liberal article under CNN's name, the tone of the article was very neutral for the most part, but it did focus on the idea of gun regulation mostly and what people have said for the push for gun regulation. And it was also mostly surprised on Trump's opinions in all this and how he shocked both Democrats and Republicans on how he felt about gun regulation. It didn't focus much on the why people are pushing for gun control, though.
The conservative article that we read for the gun control policy posed by Trump was from Fox News, and it was relatively short at only 447 words. The main points of it were the specific restrictions that would be in place for the bill that allows teachers to carry guns to school, but they didn't elaborate very much about what that would mean or who would be affected by this. And also, they mentioned some restrictions generally, but they never named specifically what those restrictions were and how they would be imposed to control guns in schools. The facts that this article used were that only teachers who had duties other than just teaching in a classroom could carry guns, and this would be teachers that have positions as coaches or club sponsors and etc. And then the bill would also create mental health programs in school, according to the article, and also it said that the bill would improve communication between schools and law enforcement, although these two facts were never supported by any other statements or facts in the article or in general, and they are more like promises that the bill would make, but there was no specific mention of how the bill could carry through with these suggestions and goals. The tone of this article was very positive when it was talking about what the bill was and the teachers that would be able to carry guns to school. However, when it referenced the Democratic opinions about the position of teachers carrying guns, it was pretty harsh, and it was very against that idea that Democrats had. And throughout the article overall, there was only facts and opinions from people that were for the gun control policy posed by Trump that teachers would carry guns to school, and there were no quotes or any other references to what the Democratic government officials were saying about this matter. There were only support from government officials that agreed with Trump about teachers carrying guns.
So for our centrist news article, we decided to go ahead with ABC. And right off the bat, what was definitely apparent is that ABC kind of broke up the way that they covered Trump's gun policy. And we can't expect them to have an article specifically relating to everything we're looking for, but that was definitely interesting. And because of that, it turned out that the information we were looking for, which is just what is Trump's policy on gun control in relation to the Parkland shooting, that was kind of strewn around in a couple different articles. So it was kind of difficult when reading the one that I chose to figure out where that was within the context of the entire debate. So that by itself makes it difficult to find the information we need. And on top of that, it was a lot more of the news source saying these are the problems that we're encountering, as opposed to, I think, more of just a news source relaying this is what happened. So it takes it a step further to say, what are the issues. So I guess that's kind of a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. As far as the source is pretty neutral, because a lot of the other on the liberal side, we had people saying, oh well, Trump is indecisive, so that means that he's bad at managing everything. And then on the other hand, it could be used as a good thing. ABC just kept it neutral. They were saying he's indecisive, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. And it was kept pretty neutral just because it was a lot of primary source fact quoting from I think it was Trump congressmen and congresswomen. So last interesting thing is that a lot of ABC's articles were actually coverage of what comedians have been saying about Trump, which is, I suppose that's news, but it's less primary fact reporting and more, it's not adding to civil discourse as much as it could, because it's not real information that's usable. It's infotainment.
So the chosen bias for part B that we chose was liberal, which was CNN. And we compared it against a newspaper website because I didn't really want to go out and buy a newspaper, and also a blog. So the newspaper website was New York Times, and then the blog was Crooks and Liars. So for the Crooks and Liars blog, the length of the article was 344 words, and it wasn't really in depth. It was kind of just surface level facts. And for the most part, it was just like observation. They used some quotes here and there from different people, but it had a very strong left bias and used many opinion words like terrible and unimpressed and stuff like that. So it wasn't very factual. It was just mainly all opinion. For the New York Times website article, it was a little longer, 642 words, and it was definitely more in depth, and you could tell that there was a lot of background research, and the quotes were they made sure that they were accurate. And also at the very end of the article, they had fact checked a bunch of statements that had been made by President Trump, and they had provided research to back that up. So you could tell that there was a lot more time and effort that was put into this article than the blog one. As for the bias, I think that it remained pretty neutral for the most part. I didn't really see any hints at bias, and so you can tell by the medium that blogs obviously don't really take into account facts and stuff. They just kind of write their opinion, whereas more prominent news sources like CNN and New York Times actually made sure that what they were saying was fact checked and accurate, rather than just putting out their opinion.
So for part 2, the evening news, we watched NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt on Monday, March 5th. The first story was called Race Against Time, about the nor'easter, and the experts were eyewitness accounts from people in the area, and it did not show any bias, and the message was only to inform people about the damaged communities, and this segment took 2 minutes and 21 seconds. The next story was Winter Storm Watch, which was just a weather segment, and it focused on the east and the upcoming storm, and it wasn't very in-depth. The only real detail they said was the wind speeds, and it was 54 seconds long. The third story is called Teacher Strike Day 8, which is about the West Virginia teachers that are on strike due to their low pay. And the experts they showed were a teacher on strike, a young child who was affected by this by not being able to go to school, and Mitch Carmichael, which is a member of the West Virginia Senate. And for the bias, it sided with the teachers, and it was against the government officials, which was shown through the many references to the extensive time they're taking to make a decision. And this segment was 1 minute and 57 seconds long. The fourth story was called Defying Mueller, and it's about how Nunberg won't comply with the subpoena from Mueller. And the experts, they had a phone interview with Nunberg,
Sarah Sanders, who's the White House press secretary, they showed just like a clip of her talking. And then they talked with Chuck Rosenberg, who's an NBC News contributor. And then this was biased to make it seem that Nunberg was wrong in his accusations, just by like the clips that they showed of him made him seem like he didn't know what he was accusing Trump of and like didn't have any evidence. And this story was 2 minutes and 18 seconds long. The next story was deadly avalanches, and it was about the avalanches in the western United States. And they had a phone interview with Evan Huck, who was an avalanche survivor, and that was the only expert shown. And it didn't have any bias. It was just warning people to be careful, and it was 1 minute and 44 seconds long. The next story is called Poisoning Mystery, which is about an ex-Russian spy who is ill in the hospital. And for experts, they had a witness of the event of him getting sick. And then Craig Holden, they showed a clip of him talking, and he's the Wiltshire Police Assistant Chief Constable. And there was no, United States political bias, but it was accusatory towards Putin on being part of this, and it was very negative towards Russia. And this was 1 minute and 35 seconds long. Next story was called Teacher's Double Life. It was about a Florida teacher being accused of white nationalism on a podcast that she has. And the experts, they showed a Huffington Post audio clip of Diana Voltage, who is the teacher being accused. And they also showed a mother of the student from her class. And they also talked to Arsalan Iftikhar, who is a Georgetown University senior fellow. And then the bias, it was negative towards the teacher, which was shown through the experts. All of the experts talked about how she was wrong in doing this. And this was 1 minute and 54 seconds long. And the 8th segment was Hacking Your Taxes, which was the IRS warning against cyber thieves. And the experts were Don Fort, who's the IRS criminal investigation chief, and Charles Gibson, a cybersecurity expert. And there was no bias, just a warning to the people and tax firms. And this was 2 minutes and 16 seconds long. The next story was called Airport Roof Collapse, which is a video of a roof collapsing at a Chinese airport. And there was no experts, no bias, and it was only 18 seconds long. The next story was called Awestruck, which is about a viral photo of a small girl looking at a Michelle Obama portrait. And the expert was, they had an interview with the child from the picture, and it showed no bias, and it was only 28 seconds long. The next story was called Stolen Oscar, which is about the Oscar stolen from Frances McDormand. And no experts, no bias, 39 seconds long. And the last story was called Inspiring America, and it was about how a principal was paying students for not fighting. And 2 8th grade students were experts, and they talked about how this is impacting them. And then they also talked to Stephanie Underwelch, who's the principal of Mitchell, the high school that she's doing this at. And then there was also an interview with the mom of a child who has improved due to the incentive. And there's no bias, and it was 1 minute and 16 seconds long. To conclude this news analysis, there were 12 stories total, and there was a lot of use of experts, witness accounts, and phone interviews, and audio clips. And the most important stories were featured at the beginning and given the most time, and they were also a lot more in depth. And then there were entertainment stories shown at the end, which were very short and under a minute and very brief, little information. And all in all, there was little bias, which correlates with NBC's typical lack of bias and their mainstream approach to giving the news.
So I used Instagram as my social media data, and I received 7 liberal posts, 0 conservative posts, and 85 non-political posts, leading up to 92 total posts. So only about 8% of my Instagram was in relation to liberal values and liberal media. For the most part, the liberal posts were in relation to LGBTQ plus history and politics, as I do follow a lot of LGBT pages that infuse democratic beliefs in their post. I also follow Bernie Sanders on my Instagram, and he posts daily. When it comes to the non-political post, I mostly have pictures of puppies, cute bats, and I follow a couple of stores like Hot Topic and Barnes & Noble that inform me of when sales are going on. The claim of we are living in information bubbles is true, as I do identify as liberal, and the only political posts I did see were liberal. It pushes me to lean more liberal as I do surround myself with it.
Okay, so for my social media, I decided to use Twitter because that is the social media that I use the most and enjoy the most. For a day, I saw 176 posts, give or take a few. Um, but I saw 45 liberal posts, 23 conservative posts, and 108 non-political posts. So for that, there was 25% was liberal, 13% was conservative, and 62% was non-political. The 25% that was liberal most likely came from articles from CNN because I follow CNN, as well as a lot of people that I follow retweet liberal stuff because most of my friends are liberals. The 13% that was conservative came from more conservative political analysts that I follow, like Ben Shapiro and Grant Van Susteren and some other people. And then the rest of my posts, the majority of my posts were non-political, and that came from a lot of sports teams that I follow, like college basketball stuff, hockey, all that, as well as memes. And then that day that I looked, there was a lot of angry Bachelor finale tweets, so that was pretty funny. But I do agree with the thing that we tend to stick to our own political bubbles, because even though I had more liberal posts than conservative posts, I see myself as a conservative, and the people that I willingly follow are normally conservative, and then I just kind of see liberal posts from other people who I follow who are liberals. So I would agree with the fact that we do tend to stick in our bubble.
For my social media analysis, I chose Twitter, and throughout the day I found 6 liberal posts, 1 conservative post, 147 non-political posts, so that made up 154 total posts. And about 3.9% of my feed was liberal posts, and only 0.65% was conservative posts. So my feed only had 4.5% of the posts dedicated to politics. And with the liberal post being higher than the conservative, it makes sense because that's the typical political views that I side with. So I'm not surprised that 95.5% of my feed wasn't political, because I don't follow many people that post political things, and I don't really like to see that when I'm looking at Twitter. And I do think the claim that we are living in information bubbles is true, because I don't like to talk about politics, which is reflected in my lack of it in my feed. And when I do look at politics, I side with liberal views, which was the majority of my political posts.
For me, my most used social media platform is Instagram, and out of one day, I saw 41 posts to analyze. Out of all of these, none of them were political. Based off of this, it's easy to say that my results do not support the claim that we all live inside our own information bubbles. I saw 0 political posts, so the information that I usually see throughout my time on social media does not affect my political views, because I rarely engage with other people's political views and opinions through social media.
In my Twitter throughout one day, I noticed that I had a total of 41 posts on my feed, and 40 of them were non-political. 1 of them was liberal, and none of them were conservative. So about 2.4% of my posts were political on my social media in one day. And the posts that did show up were only liberal, and there were no conservative posts. And I think that is true to who I am, because I am more liberal than conservative. So it makes sense that there were only liberal posts and not conservative ones. I also don't find this number very surprising, that it's only 2.4%, because I don't generally follow any politicians or any news sources, so I wouldn't get as much posts related to politics as others would. The people I do follow sometimes post about politics, but not very frequently, so it's not at all surprising that I didn't have many political posts in one day. And however, I don't think this supports the idea that we create information bubbles because there were hardly any posts about politics in my feed. Granted, I don't usually engage in conversation about politics, but I do have strong opinions. So I don't think that my social media accounts for the opinions that I do have, because I don't choose to follow in any political arguments or conversations that happen on social media.
So the only social media I really use is Instagram. I went through it. I had a solid 50 posts. 49 of those were non-political. One of them was a conservative slanted post, and I didn't have any liberal slanted political posts. So because of that, I have to conclude that my social media does not create an echo chamber for me, especially because when I saw that one political post, it actually surprised me that one of my friends was posting something like that on their social media. Because on any given day, I would say I'd have 50 posts and 0 of them are political at all.